Now, Pete, talking about Singapore, he was a Fulbright exchange teacher over there, and he's been with the school district for a number of years in San Francisco Unified. His entire career has actually, been there, and I knew him when he was the journalism teacher at Phillip High School. He did go beyond and did staff training for the district, and currently he's the librarian at Phillip and Saliburton High School in San Francisco. So, Pete, it's all yours.
Thank you, Paul. As you can tell from that introduction, I'm not an academic expert on China, or I don't have the extensive experience that George has with consulting. My experience is having been in China a fair amount for the last 10 or 12 years as a visitor, as a student. And I would like to just briefly share with you today a story that to me exemplifies a really important concept that we as teachers need to keep in mind when we are preparing lessons about China, when we're developing curriculum. It's a story about a Chinese friend who I met here in the United States in the late 1990s. He was born in China, went to school there, got an undergraduate degree, and came to the United States to do graduate work in the early 1990s. And he got an MBA here in the United States. He got a green card. He worked in a couple of dot-com companies in the late 1990s, and went back to China after about 10 years, which was about 10 or 12 years ago. I kept up with my friend after he went back to China, when seeing him there and seeing him when he came back here. His interest in going back to China was to kind of see what had happened to China during that 10 years when he was gone, and to decide whether he wanted to live in China or the United States, because he is entirely capable of living either place, both culturally and linguistically and legally. And so he traveled around China for a few months when he returned, and settled in Beijing, and decided to try his hand at becoming a documentary filmmaker. And his first film actually showed on PBS stations here in the United States. So flash forward a few years to February of 2006, and I was alarmed to hear that this friend had been arrested by the Chinese government authorities while he was filming a documentary about underground Christian churches in China. And by underground Christian churches, what I mean is Christian groups that are not authorized by the government. They haven't registered by with the government. And my friend was filming a group meeting on a Sunday morning in someone's apartment in Beijing. And the security forces came in and, among other things, asked for his filming equipment, and he refused to give it to them, and he ended up being arrested. And so, of course, I was very alarmed by that, and his case generated some media attention. He had been blogging since he had returned to China. And so a lot of other bloggers, especially in East Asia, started posting his name on a little symbol with his name on their blogs to express their solidarity with him and to generate news about him. My friend's sister was a kind of mid-level executive in a Chinese corporation. She was living in Shanghai, so she advocated with the government authorities on his behalf. And I and his friends, other friends here in the United States, were kind of wondering what we could do or shouldn't do. We didn't want to ignore the situation, but we also didn't want to do anything that might contribute to his difficulties and his incarceration. So in July of that year, I was going to China for a visit, and I picked up a New York Times to read on the airplane going over there, and saw a news brief in the international section which reported that my friend had been released from custody. And so he had been held for about 5 months. And of course I was very relieved, and I kind of had heard that might be coming to that. But I also was concerned about what I was going to find when I got to China and met up with my friend again. I was really concerned about what his physical condition might be. I have, like what could happen in 5 months of being in a Chinese jail. I was concerned about his psychological condition, and I was really steeling myself for a very difficult encounter with him. So when I arrived in Beijing, I gave him a call, and he said, let's have lunch. And so we met for lunch, and over lunch, he talked about the 5 months that he had spent in incarceration. He was held in an army facility, and so his guards were young army soldiers. And my friend said that that turned out to be quite an opportunity for him, that since his return to China, one of the questions that he had been wanting to understand better was what was going on for rural people in China. And he said, there I was. I had a lot of time to talk with a lot of guys from rural areas in China about what their lives were like now. He said he spent most of his time during incarceration just sitting around waiting. He said that he knew that one of the questions that the investigators would need to resolve was he making this documentary film in an effort to undermine the government in some way? And my friend said he knew that that wasn't the case, that wasn't his intention, but he also understood that it was going to take the investigators a while to figure that out. And my friend also knew that because he lived with his boyfriend was a Taiwanese man who was kind of a high-ranking executive in the Beijing branch of a Taiwanese corporation, that the Chinese authorities were going to wonder if Taiwanese money was financing his film, and as an effort to embarrass the Chinese government. And again, my friend said, you know, I knew that that wasn't the case, but I knew it would take them a while to figure that out. I asked my friend, I was concerned, I had been thinking the whole time that he was incarcerated, wondering if the fact that he was gay was going to somehow complicate his situation, be used against him, kind of undermine him psychologically or something like that. So I asked about that, and he said, well, of course they knew that he was gay because they raided his apartment and took his computer, and you know, there was no secret about that. But what he said was, you know, the soldiers just kind of treated it in a casual, joking kind of way. He said, for example, that sometimes a group of soldiers would come up, people that he knew, you know, from being around them, and would say, you know, we think so-and-so is the cutest one of us. What do you think? Who's the cutest guy here? My friend was beaten during his incarceration. And he said it didn't happen much, and he never had the sense that it was going to get too serious. But there was one incident toward the very end of his incarceration that he had found kind of an epiphany from, that one of the soldiers who had been a buddy, kind of, you know, as much as you could be in that situation, but had been told to knock my friend around, and was doing that. And it was bad enough that my friend started crying. And the soldier kind of realized that it was taking its toll and kind of bent over and started whispering, it's okay, I'm almost done, this is not a big deal, you know, it's going to be okay. And my friend said, you know, that he had this epiphany at that point. As I said, he was wondering where he wanted to spend his life, and he felt at that point, you know, China is where I want to be, this is my home, that with all the good and all the bad, this is it for me. I'm Chinese and I live here in China. And so, you know, a lot of this was very surprising to me. It wasn't what I was expecting. And I kind of finished up by asking him what he was going to be doing next. And my assumption was that he was probably going to become an activist in human rights organizations or something, that after being kind of unjustly confined for 5 months and going through all this ordeal, that he would seek some kind of, you know, justice that way. And he said, you know, I don't have any interest in that at all. I have lots of dreams about what I want to do. I've got lots of projects, and becoming a human rights activist will get in the way of all of those. I'm ready to move on and do some more of the things that I want to do. So the next night, I had dinner in Beijing with 2 U.S. journalists. A man and a woman. They were boyfriend and girlfriend there. They're married then. They are married now. The female journalist was writing for a major American news weekly, and she had been in my Chinese class when I had studied Chinese in Beijing a few years earlier, so I knew her pretty well and had kept up with her. And her boyfriend was writing for a major U.S. daily newspaper. And they knew about my friend's case, of course, and they knew that he had just been released, and they knew that I was staying with him. And I didn't want to talk much about his situation because I didn't want to be the conduit for any information that was private for him that would be passed on to two journalists. But I did say that I was relieved that my friend's being gay had not complicated his incarceration, or that he didn't feel like it had. And the male journalist responded to that. He said, "Your friend is lucky he wasn't, that he was held in Beijing. If he had been held out in the provinces, it wouldn't have been so nice." And I also just mentioned that I found myself relieved that he wasn't planning to become a human rights activist, because I kind of felt that what I realized is I felt if he did that, it might make it harder for us to be friends, that somehow just him moving into that kind of life would affect our friendship somehow. And so I just said I was relieved that that wasn't what he was going to be doing. And the male journalist said in a tone that I took to be kind of a mixture of frustration and irritation, "None of the Chinese want to be dissidents." The female reporter said the angle on the story that she might pursue would be interviewing my friend's sister to find out what it was like for her to be an advocate with the authorities on behalf of an incarcerated family member. And so it was real clear to me that neither of these journalists were going to ever hear what I had found to be a really interesting story that my friend had told me at lunch the day before. I think if I had said he was, and I don't say that casually, I'm really sure that if I had said he was planning to become active with a human rights organization, they would have been asking me for his phone number. And I share this story because to me it explains really well, it's an example of a concept that all of the speakers have referred to today, this filter that American media puts on news that we get from China. The story that they wanted to hear was the dissident story. And since that wasn't the story that they could see, they missed what to me was a really fascinating description of my friend's experience of 5 months of incarceration. And I think it's really important, and my plea to you, and my point in participating here, is to ask that when you are creating lessons and developing curriculum about China, especially on contemporary issues, but on historical issues as well, is that you find Chinese voices to share with your students, that you not rely on the American media, which is extremely filtered. Because if we rely on the American media to inform our students, we're only going to collaborate in this process that other speakers have talked about today of this coming train wreck. You know, that if we want to avoid and diminish this potential for friction and hostility between the United States and China, as educators, a really important thing we can do is make sure that the Chinese voices are being heard in our classroom.
Thank you, Pete. Questions for him or Lin Chi at this time?
So one of the things I keep hearing through the different panels of today and yesterday was, bias. And something that concerns me as a teacher because, we've been taught that we want to keep it on an equal and playing field. So I am proposing to my panel and colleagues that we get some primary sources that we can use, that we can present to our students, because some of these topics, depending on our grade level and who our audience is, probably may or may not work for what we're doing. But I think we all want to have a fair understanding of, that there is commonality between the two countries. I'm hearing more differences and more negatives than I'm hearing positives. So I think that's one of the things that we need to present to our student population is what are some of the things that are working, and I haven't heard a lot of that. So that's a concern of mine as a middle school teacher that wants to take these ideas, downsize them so that I can build up from what high school is going to be presenting to, to the students. Thank you.
Thank you, Susan. You will be very surprised that we actually have been thinking about exactly what you're saying. And I mean that seriously. But let me go to another question or two before we get to
Good.
the other piece. Yes, Pete?
Could I respond to that? Sure. Very briefly. This is in the shameless self-promotion category, but since you said you're a 7th grade teacher, the project Paul referred to that I worked on in Singapore, I have a 7th grade lesson there on Zheng He, the navigator, and the question to investigate was Zheng He a peaceful ambassador or an imperial aggressor? And that is filled with, not filled with, but it's all based on primary sources from the period. And that's a discussion that is being held in Southeast Asia at this moment with obvious connections to the present political situation. So that would be one way of approaching these things, through primary sources.
Any other questions? Jim?
Our experience as with friends, when we make friends, person to person, is very different from what you hear from the media and from politicians and from history books, right? And that once you have a friendship, I mean, I know that when I go to China and I talk to my friends, I can talk about any subject, and I get their honest political views about what's going on, as long as we're not in a public forum, you know, talking to officials, or, right? So it strikes me that, you know, your story really hits, you know, an angle that is very important, and that when we talk person to person, we're talking about real people, and what's of concern to those people in their own lives, not just some big political agenda.
Thank you for that comment. I'm going to say, okay, oh, Lin Chi, go ahead. Lin Chi.
You know, just in answer to the earlier question, you know, I actually wanted to say, if I didn't have a chance to conclude it, and that is that, you know, when you look at an issue that comes up, I think always look for the context. The newspaper does not give you the context. And also, even more important is comparison. For instance, you know, okay, we talk about land seizure in China, which is very common, part of the corruption. But I think we should also take a look at the urban renewal, you know, redevelopment in this country. I mean, I live in an area called Western Addition in San Francisco, where the Japantown is. Do you know how many families, black families, got removed? 12,000 families got removed from that area to create that space. So I think it's very important for us to always look at the context and also look at the comparison, because the comparison is what will help us at least put something into perspective so that it will not be so biased.
This is a good segue into what we're going to be doing later. And I'm going to invite somebody to come up here to get you guys all set up for this afternoon, because you have heard many things. As you know, as Meg spoke of this morning, there are so many aspects to which you have dealt with. I mean, in a day and a half already, there are things you have heard from yesterday and today. How do you make sense of what's going on? How do you get more resources? How do you piece it together for your students? So we are very, very lucky to have 3 people. Pete, and you heard from Sushu yesterday, and now you're going to hear from Dr. Alice Cheng, who's a longtime member of the 1990 Institute. She is a retired, actually, I don't think she's retired the way she goes at this, IBM software engineer. She was educated at Wellesley, Harvard, and CCNY, and she's been in this area for a long time. And I wanted to turn this over to you because you're going to hear now what's going to happen in terms of the next steps that really bring concreteness and relevance and the collaboration that really is required. Because you cannot teach what you've heard and what you want to translate into lessons by yourself. You got to do it together with others, and this is where the next step comes in. Alice?
Thank you, Paul. I'm just going to take a few minutes. I know I'm between you and lunch, and so I'll be very brief. But Pete and Sushu and myself will be facilitating the activities of the curriculum development this afternoon. And by now, many of you, your heads may be swimming with information, and you'll be saying to yourself, I've heard so many new and rich information. What am I going to do with it? How am I going to bring it back to my students in my classroom? So that's what this afternoon will allow you to do. You will break up in small groups and talk to each other about what you heard, reflect on it, digest it together, brainstorm on lesson resources that you can build.